Okay, in this presentation, I will sketch a rough outline on the reception of Josiah Royce and William James in Germany. And first, I will give a background to Royce's ties to Germany. In the second step, I elaborate on the reception of James. As far as William James, I will comment on the pioneering work of Professor Hans Joas and Professor Klaus Oehler. I will do so from the perspective of a member of a younger scholarly generation. I will support the thesis that the historical misrepresentations still have some considerable repercussions on how James is perceived in Germany today. In the third part, I emphasize some key motives regarding the reception in light of recent debates. And finally, in a very short last paragraph, I will make some remarks on what the reception of William James could look like in the future. And this holds also for Royce, I hope at least. And I will now turn to the topic Royce and Germany. As John Glenending points out in his intellectual biography, the life and thought of Josiah Royce, as a young Berkeley graduate in 1875 to 1876, Royce studied in Heidelberg, Leipzig, and Göttingen. In Heidelberg, he improved his command of the German language. In Leipzig, however, he studied anthropology and logic with Wundt, the history of German philosophy with Strümpel, and Greek philosophy with Windelband. In Göttingen, finally, he attended courses on Kant and metaphysics and practical philosophy by Lotze. So one could entitle this chapter, and I quote here, "I have a strong desire to hear Lotze." Lotze's post-Kantian idealism had the strongest impact on Royce. Back in the United States, Royce accepted a teaching position at the Johns Hopkins University. His first course dealt with Schopenhauer, and we remember Dr. McDermott's remark on the sadness, the existential sadness that might be due to Schopenhauer's philosophy. Additionally, Royce ardently wrote on Kant before he later realized that his own thoughts displayed a strong kinship with Hegel, and this would be, from my part, a question to be raised in the discussion whether Royce is a neo-Hegelian or not, because as such he is perceived in Germany, and he himself might have some ambivalent ideas about Hegel, and Dr. Laux mentioned Fichte as a strong influence. Anyway, alas, it seems that Josiah Royce's affectionate feelings for Germany and German philosophy were not on a reciprocal basis. Up to date, Royce's philosophy has never been well received in Germany. There are, of course, some works worth mentioning. Most recently, Ludwig Nagel published articles on Royce's absolute pragmatism and his concept of community. Nicola Erny's recent book on Peirce's ethics contains a chapter about Royce's conception of reality. A remarkable contribution was the dissertation of Hartmut Falke in 1982, who represented Royce as a mediator between Peirce's and James's philosophy that analyzed the idea of the unconditioned. In the 1970s, the Protestant theologian Eilert Herms, of whom we have a student here from Tübingen, an assistant, dealt with Royce's philosophy of religion. In 1962, the historian Karl Theo Humbach published his dissertation on the individual and the society in Royce's philosophy. So there might be some more works worth mentioning, but this is what I found so far. Anyhow, around 27 years after his trip to Germany as a graduate student, in 1908, Matthias already mentioned this, Royce returned to Heidelberg again, this time as a Harvard professor, to give a talk at the International Congress of Philosophy. The Heidelberg Conference was also the starting point for the German reception of William James, to which I will turn now. So I come to my second part, the reception of William James, time before World War I. William James entertained rich intellectual friendships with many German-speaking intellectuals, among them Ernst Mach, Wilhelm Wundt, and Wilhelm Jerusalem. Nevertheless, the German reception of his philosophy has never been an easy one. One of its milestones was the previously mentioned Philosophical World Congress in Heidelberg in 1908 under the presidency of Wilhelm Windelband. This was just when James's pragmatism lectures had appeared and were congenially translated by Wilhelm Jerusalem. Additionally, there were several other German translations of James's works available. During the conference, Josiah Royce talked about the topic, the problem of truth, in the light of recent discussion, putting forward his own absolute pragmatism. Due to Royce's talk, James, Dewey, and F.C.S. Schiller became the central figures of discussion. But afterwards, the German reception of pragmatism, including Royce's work, was interrupted by World War I and was not pursued further. Instead, a history of misunderstandings began. In what follows, I will identify 8 key motives that guided, or better, misguided the German reception of James's philosophy. So I come to my third part. Motive 1. James the Epigone. It is a commonplace of misunderstanding that James's philosophy is regarded as an imitation of someone else's thought, be it of Ernst Mach's philosophy, as Fritz Mautner thought, or Nietzsche's philosophy, as Georg Simmel maintained. This dwells on the notion of a philosophy of life, of course. In contrast to Hans Joas, who puts emphasis on this, I think, however, that the main problem today is that James is regarded as a bad imitator and epigone of either the British empiricists or of Charles Sanders Peirce. James's pragmatism was, and still is, understood as a primitive and faulty imitation of Charles Sanders Peirce's philosophy. I will come back to this in a minute. Turn now to the second motive, pragmatism in light of German nationalism. As Hans Joas shows, the case of the young philosophy professor Günther Jacobi from Greifswald is a paradigmatic case for the time before World War I. In his younger years, Jacobi had been an inspired interpreter of James, but later on he became committed to German nationalism and infiltrated his interpretation of James with national stereotypes. For my generation, Günther Jacobi's writings do not play a preeminent role anymore, but his problematic vein of interpretation, however, remains alive. And I will say a few more words about this in the last chapter. Turn now to the third motive, as I call it, misunderstandings of the pragmatist idea of knowledge. And this is what all of you will know. In his book, Erkenntnis und Arbeit, 1926, Max Scheler, who was one of the founders of philosophical anthropology in Germany, famously misunderstood pragmatism. For him, the pragmatist only had a knowledge of control, Herrschaftswissen, but no knowledge of essence, Bildungs- oder Wesenswissen in German, and no knowledge of salvation, Erlösungswissen. Despite this misunderstanding, Scheler nevertheless welcomed the idea of pragmatism as a philosophy anchored in real life and in action. So Ken Stickers has done some important work about Scheler. We'll now come to a time around World War II and National Socialism in Germany and, of course, its aftermath. So I will start with some totalitarian and anti-democratic tendencies, Heidegger, Gehlen, and the philosophy of action. Martin Heidegger's philosophy displays numerous resemblances with pragmatism. Hans Joas calls it a hidden pragmatism, such as the basis of theoretic knowledge in practice and action. Heidegger, of course, avidly read Scheler and possibly some scholarly literature on James. However, as Hans Joas remarks, Heidegger, due to his own anti-democratic sentiments, entirely rejected the pluralist and democratic attitudes of the pragmatists. The same holds for Arnold Gehlen, another founder of German anthropology. Gehlen belonged to a group of German supporters of pragmatism who sympathized with National Socialism. I think at this point, some negative repercussions of this problematic reception become evident. When scholars of my generation get in touch with William James's philosophy for the first time, they already have some vague background knowledge that James was well received by philosophers who were somehow associated with fascism, most prominently, of course, Mussolini in Italy. This reception certainly leaves a bitter taste on James, unjustified as it is. Action as a philosophical notion is still ambivalent in Germany because it is tied to hero worshipping and the so-called idea of the Tatmensch, man or woman of action. To be found, for instance, I looked this up in von Eichstedt's typology of the races. Tatmensch. Okay, I will come back to this and turn now to my fifth motive. The identification of pragmatism with capitalism and positivism. So I turn now to the other side, Bloch and Horkheimer. From the other side, it was Marxist philosophy, the Marxist philosophy of the German emigrants in the United States that played a role in the incorrect reception as well. Ernst Bloch, Max Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse regarded the pragmatist theory of truth as the expression of a capitalist worldview. Think only of the cash value metaphor, of course. And they thought that pragmatism instrumentalized human beings, so to say. Martin Jay, and this was pointed out by Professor Oehler, wrote that the Institute of Social Research existed in splendid isolation and was not in touch with American philosophers. The immigrants mistakenly identified pragmatism with positivism. This is another vein of interpretation. In addition to Ewert's account, it is worth mentioning, although it is somewhat paradoxical, that in Germany today, James's pragmatism is often understood as a form of Marxist philosophy, perhaps based on his idea that philosophy has to actively change the world for the better, and maybe also due to his anti-imperialism. Okay. I now come to motive 6, pragmatism and phenomenology. This is a line of influence that is still alive. Another route of interpretation, however, was traveled by Alfred Schütz and others. Schütz demonstrated the intellectual kinship between James's psychology and Husserl's phenomenology. For my scholarly generation, this influence is still important for Germany's so-called new phenomenology. The founders, among them Martin Waldenfels and Ferdinand Fellmann, belong to the few philosophers who make William James's philosophy fruitful within the framework of the new phenomenological thought. I think there is some problematic point in that, because usually people who are interested in phenomenology usually dwell largely on his psychology and not so much on his pragmatism. Maybe we could pick this up in a discussion. Coming back to motive 7. After World War II, in the German Democratic Republic, again, kind of leftist understanding of pragmatism. Pragmatism regarded as imperialist philosophy, paradoxical as this may seem. As Hans Joas points out, in 1946, the German sociologist Helmut Schelsky triggered a debate about Eduard Baumgarten's reception of pragmatism, which became important for the Erlangen School via Wilhelm Kammler. But the discussion was not continued due to a lack of interest. After the 1960s, in the German Democratic Republic, pragmatism again was misunderstood as imperialist philosophy by, for example, Georg Lukács, the literary critic. The Marxist philosopher Ludwig Marcuse, however, his positive interpretation, as one must say, of pragmatism, therefore did not draw much attention. Now turn to the last motive, motive 8, the 1960s. The renaissance of Prussian pragmatism by works of Kempsky, Apel and Habermas. In 1957, Jürgen von Kempsky's study on Peirce was published, and it launched a real renaissance for pragmatism after its interruption in 1908. Real breakthrough for pragmatist thought in Germany happened in the 1960s with Karl Otto Apel's book on Peirce and Jürgen Habermas' Erkenntnis und Interesse that dealt largely with Peirce and Mead. According to Hans Joas, the German transcendental tradition made Peirce's semiotics most welcome. In contrast to Hans Joas, I believe that it is not only due to Peirce's Kantianism for why Peirce is better received in Germany than James and Dewey, but rather his compatibility with analytic approaches. Due to his semiotics, today, Peirce is even regarded as a predecessor of analytic philosophy, whereas James and Dewey are seen as non-analytic authors with a phenomenological style that focused on daily Lebenswelt. The most problematic point is that those German scholars of the analytic tradition who appreciate Peirce's work usually despise James's theory of truth. James's theory of truth serves as a textbook example of a flawed constructivist, instrumentalist, or utilitarianist theory. James's metaphysics of experience and his pluralism, however, are more or less ignored. So I will come now to conclusions and some future prospects. The value of James today is, how I entitled it somewhat optimistically. In the beginning of this paper, I supported the thesis that the historical misrepresentations of James's philosophy still have an impact on the reputation of James's philosophy in Germany today. This holds mainly for the fact that some anti-democratic thinkers sympathize with pragmatism. This still gives James's philosophy a bitter taste, as I claimed, unjustified as this is. Furthermore, there is another source of misunderstanding that has its repercussions in the present. It is the reading of James's philosophy as a primitive and faulty imitation of Peirce's philosophy, which is much better known in Germany. So far, in what follows, I will deal with some future prospects his philosophy might bear. I hope that a better understanding of James's philosophy could also raise the interest in Josiah Royce, of course. I think in this context, there are at least 3 ideas to be found in James's philosophy that could help to compensate the incorrect historical reception of his philosophy. First, I said that James's pluralism is more or less forgotten in Germany. Political confederations, however, like, for example, the European Union, as well as federal states, need new role models and more sophisticated ideas of multiculturalism and pluralism. James's idea of pluralism could be made fruitful for a better understanding of multilaterality and, on a larger scale, for the so-called deglobalization movement. Second, James was and still is misunderstood as a positivist thinker. Think, for example, of Horkheimer and Bloch. Rather, I think James's as well as Royce's philosophy are veritable alternatives to the current bold naturalization of the mind. Nowadays, after the so-called decade of neuroscience, there are ardent controversies going on in German philosophy about mental phenomena like the freedom of the will and moral agency in the face of recent empirical findings. Within this framework, James's idea of a noetic pluralism in his 5th pragmatism lecture should be reconsidered, I think. The scientific image alone cannot give us a full account of the world, important as it is. Rather, we have to resort to the worldviews of common sense, metaphysics, and religion in order to make sense out of the brute empirical facts with which science provides us. And last point is, third, outside theological circles in Germany, James's careful philosophical analysis of religion is not well known in Germany. Even today, if you survey the knowledge of German philosophy students, James is mainly known for his pragmatist theory of truth. Perpetuating Max Scheler's misunderstanding, it is assumed that as a pragmatist, James does not do justice to ideas such as transcendence and salvation. I think in the face of growing tensions between the world religions on one hand and religious and secular ideas of society on the other, I think we are in urgent need of a competent but respectful science of religion that fosters rational dialogue. A science of religion as James founded it in his Varieties of Religious Experience. I think the only way to deal properly with current problems is to take respective religious ideals and experiences seriously. However, some pragmatic procedures have to be established in order to assess religion's values for life and for a peaceful coexistence. Reconsidering James's pragmatism allows us to ask which mode of life we want to lead in order to make a more just and peaceful world possible, be it of a religious or of secular shape. Thank you.